So for our first topic, educational models for future architects and urban planners, I am pleased to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Mark Alwaney. Dr. Alwaney is a researcher, architect, and senior lecturer in the University of Lincoln School of Architecture and the Built Environment in the UK, and at Uganda Martyrs University. Dr. Alwaney has experience in environmental design, urban design, sustainable architecture, and architectural education in developing countries, and he has a PhD in architecture from Cardiff University. Dr. Alwaney, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Corinne. I would like to have ability to share the screen if possible. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussions that are going to follow. I still cannot share my screen.
We'll give you 1 second, Dr. Alwaney. We are working on that. Apologies.
You can. You can do it now, I think.
I am good now. Okay, thank you so much.
Perfect.
Okay, that was the easy bit. The other bit is actually finding out what you're supposed to present. Where is it? Keynote. Yep, okay, can you see that title slide?
Yeah, yes.
Fantastic. I titled this presentation Thoughts on the Education of Future Architects and Planners, and although I could clarify this or quantify it by saying sub-Saharan Africa, it could probably apply to any place around the world because there's similar issues that affect architecture and urbanism in different parts of the world. As has been presented, I am an architect and urban planner, and it was something I did deliberately because at a very early part of my career, I thought it was important to actually take on both of those because I could see this as building up into something quite important into the future. So my trajectory through university itself has led me to some of the decisions that I've come to in my own career and some of the highlights or the thoughts on what architecture education and planning education could be into the future. So as we see, although this presentation, as I said, is concentrated on Africa, we can apply a lot of these broadly because some of the similar issues come out. At a global level, we generally talk about architecture and urbanism of Africa, but it generally relates to the mega cities as we see on this map here from the diaspora group. This is quite an old one, so it's obviously been updated since. But some of the challenges with presenting in this way, it makes the assumption or the presumption that the mega cities are where actually the problems are. And you look at this map and they highlight the key ones. Of course, you've got the mega cities in Nigeria, north in Cairo, and then you've got a few propping up in the south and the east. What we're not told is the rate of urbanization that actually exists on the ground. So you've got Gabon, which is 90% urbanized. At the other end of the scale, you've got Niger, which is 17%. So the information that we're given on the map like this sort of removes a key part of that discussion, which has to do with population movements, secondary cities in particular, which are cities between 500,000 and 1 million, and the growth that is happening there and the challenges that exist in those particular cases. Now, to put this in perspective, we look at a few architects and planning registration boards around the world. Now, the data I got here is mainly for architects. So we've got Kenya, where we have a considerable number of architects, but when you look at the registration statistics, 92% of registered firms actually are based in Nairobi. That doesn't leave many in the other cities. Very similar situation exists in Uganda. What does that mean? That really means that those architects, although they're probably working in all these different centers, are bringing with them similar ideas from the mega cities and taking them to smaller cities, which means that they're exacerbating problems that will probably existed in the main centers and taking them to the smaller centers rather than working the other way around. So what probably is happening there is that the problem of urbanization, urban centers, and population growth probably is going to get larger because we're not actually addressing the key problems that exist on the ground. And this feeds back into education itself, where the education that people are receiving likely is related directly to the large urban areas. And this has to do with the historical development of education, which I'll talk about slightly later. But let's have a look on some of the other things that come to mind. Let's look at definitions of urbanization and how this also contributes to some of the challenges that we face. So we look at a definition that's used by South Africa, where urbanization is defined as a place where there's some form of local authority, and it includes both formal and informal urban centers. Now, because of that definition, we have what is defined as urban as being about 67%, with a growth rate of about 2%. We have a look at Ghana. Ghana defines urbanization as a town or community with a population of 5,000. So we now have a population of urban as 57%. But now we have these two. We have Kenya, where their definition is any center with a population of 10,000, and it needs to be gazetted. Now, because of that, we end up with a massive drop in urbanization that is now down to 28%. And when you look at Uganda, which basically says urbanization is something that is gazetted by government, it's down to 24%. Now, this considerably skews the reality that is on the ground, because on the ground, we know if we take 5,000 or we take a local authority, the picture on the ground considerably changes, which means that how we present this information in education is not giving us the true picture of what is on the ground, which means that we are unable to address these issues in any way or form. Now, historically, and these are some of the images that I've picked up in the context of Kampala that show some of the conditions that are exacerbated by this. But when we look broadly around at the history of education itself, we see another challenge. And these are some statistics that came out of a survey of planning and architecture by the Commonwealth Association of Planners and the Commonwealth Association of Architects, which shows the range of the range that we have here. So you got populations per member of the National Planning Association. So you got Bangladesh, which is quite high, and the UK, which is down the bottom there, which shows the relationship between planners and population. When we have the number of planning schools, you see Nigeria has a substantial number, and then you'll go the way down to Malta and Trinidad, which are much lower. But of course, the populations for those are markedly different. So the planning schools they have versus population can cope with a situation like that. Problem comes when you start looking at architecture. And this is now an inverse map. So on one side, you have the number of registered architects per 1,000 people, and the other side, you have the rate of urbanization. And there's an inverse relationship here, which starts speaking about some of the challenges that we have on the ground here. When you look at the number of the ratio of architects, you can see Malta now is excelling in that area. And then you see Uganda completely at a loss at the bottom with 0.004 architects per 1,000 people, which suggests that there's a lot of stuff going on in Uganda, Ghana, Bangladesh that is not directly done by any registered professional. When you come to number of schools, it's a very similar scenario as well, where you've got the smaller countries having probably one school, but because of the population, that number is quite high versus countries with large populations, not enough architects there. So now when you put these together, architects and planning groups, there is obviously plenty of work available for the professionals. But because they're concentrated in a small area, their ability to make a difference diminishes greatly as a result of being in the primate cities. So related to that, part of my research has been thinking, how can we optimize this? How can we actually make this work for everybody and make this, this process linking professionals to what activities on the ground, how can we make it less of us and them? And this book, Radical Pedagogies, is a good one. And it starts off with a key point in there where the editors of this book suggest that the book itself is designed for obsolescence. And I took this as an important part of our ability to address some of the challenges that we face on the ground in architecture and planning. In that, a number of things that we teach, a number of the things we profess are probably not they're probably obsolete and no longer relevant for some of the things that we teach that are happening on the ground today. And this has to do with, again, the historic development of the profession, and we will come to that shortly. It also relates to the issue of values and ethics. What do we teach? What is the goal of our educational process, and what changes do we want to see as a result of that? A number of times when we come across ethics, it tends to be restricted to when you graduate, rather than what we teach, how we teach it, what we want our students to take on board. And this becomes a problem when you see the key issues that relate to architecture and planning, where you would like students, when they graduate, to take on board some of the challenges that are on the ground. But because of what they're taught, how they're taught it, and where they've taught it, that is not embedded in the system. And therefore, the chance of them engaging with those activities is greatly diminished. Another thing that affects this is also the models of education that we use. And here are a range of them. And in my research, while there are opportunities for things like electives, what I've found for the most part is most schools of planning and architecture have a very strong core curriculum and virtually no electives, which means the one thing that is of utmost importance in these curricula, the ability to speak to other people, the ability to listen to other people, doesn't exist, which means that the professions themselves become the problem because they do not take into account the reality that once you leave the university setting, you will actually be interfacing with a number of different people. It goes on even into the formats of these professions. And this is a version of the previous one, so I'm not really going to go into that one. But we start thinking, how are we going to engage with the future? And this image on the left of the screen there, I found in relation to the post-colonial period or the independence movement. And it actually comes from Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was called then. And it was designed as a way of promoting Eastern European or the Soviet bloc interventions in Africa. What it actually says there in Russian, or I'm probably paraphrasing, not quoting here, it's about the Africans mastering their own domain. It's about ending bondage. And at the bottom there, it states down with the colonialists, i.e. referring to Western Europe. Now, looking at architecture, we have to now see how can we decolonize architecture and planning education such that the education itself becomes a key driver for change, rather than hoping that change happens after people leave the schools. So we have to think what education itself is. And education is one of those processes that we probably don't think too much about, but it is quite powerful in creating scenarios that are very difficult to change. And Grost in 1901 made that statement that humanity itself is now becoming more organized around what we teach, essentially a manufactured reality, rather than one that is geared towards addressing constantly changing realities. And then, of course, the reality that formal education, particularly in planning and architecture, is not part of the African educational approach. It was essentially brought in from Europe, And therefore, as Foster noted, it was Africans being educated like Europeans. And if you do look at the early curricula, that was very, very overt and very obvious. And then lastly, of course, from the point of view of someone who went through that system, the fact that their own experiences were ignored. And once you ignore some of the experiences, essentially you marginalize them, the ability to respond to them going forward is greatly reduced. So on the other side, we have these two that we have to be addressing more succinctly. In the end, education its most essential mission is to develop within each student the capacity to build competences, but also to be wise in the choices they make. And lastly, by Porter, the idea that we're spending a lot of money embedding values in students. And the values we embed in education are an important part of that discussion. So what are some of these values? The key one, of course, is collaboration. The fact that students need to speak to other professions, they need to engage with students from different parts of the world, different parts of Africa, so that they come to understand that their opinion is one of many, and the more you listen to, the better able you are to make decisions going forward. The fact that as educators ourselves, we probably need to introduce some alternative pedagogies to help us reach a much broader population. The standard approach that exists, particularly in architecture education, and this is a debate we're having even here in the UK, where you put students in a studio, that studio is yours, doesn't really play out very well anymore, particularly after COVID, which has been demonstrated that that actually can be dispensed with to a degree. And so other ways of doing it have to come into play. And of course, a major one is this idea of travel, not only internationally, but within your country or region, talking to people to find out what they actually think. One of the biggest challenges in architectural and planning education is the eventual belief that what we do is because we are the experts. And yet the reality is we are just conduits for people's ideas. And that has to be something that we take on board. Now, coming back to quickly finish this off, the original curricula of architecture or built environment education, as you can see on the left in terms of the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, embedded some of these ideas in there. You started off with a general degree and then you branched off to these different components. My own interpretation is on the right of this screen, which I produced about 10 years ago. I probably should update this because there are lots of ideas that come out of this, is showing the interrelationship between different elements of the curriculum. So we've got interior architecture, we've got technology, landscape architecture, and engineering can all share some communality, particularly in the early phases. And that starts embedding within these programs a key element that is currently missing because a lot of these courses are done in silos, and in some cases, not even in the same schools. So you've got planning and architecture supposedly working on the same thing, but sitting on different parts of a university, which is a recipe for problems in the future. And then the last one, this is my last slide, is having the strength and being brave enough to transform things so that students are better able to address the challenges they will face. And that is key. The challenges the students today will be facing tomorrow will likely be quite different from what the challenges are today. And as we're doing that, reformatting the curriculum, being brave enough to change things around, being brave enough to shuffle things around so that they start addressing some of these conditions that exist in the future. And key to that is also being brave enough to eliminate some aspects of the curricula which are not relevant to the conditions that we're in. And to finish off, I'll just leave you with that as a question. Are we able to engage with architecture and planning education for a sustainable future in Africa by looking at what we have now and planning for it to work for the future? Thank you very much, Corinne. I'll pass it back to you.